6 years without a handshake. 6 years of every meal eaten from factory-sealed packaging, standing alone over his kitchen counter at midnight, and Lennox Farrow had nearly convinced himself this was simply the cost of being a careful man. He ran Farrow Intelligence Group from a converted estate in Gloucester, Massachusetts, 45 minutes north of Boston, with its back to the Atlantic Ocean. His firm handled corporate espionage investigations, private extraction operations, and high-level protection for people who couldn't call the FBI. Lennox was worth roughly $300 million and had not shaken a single hand in 6 years, had not sat at a dinner table with another human being in 6 years, had not let anyone cook so much as a cup of coffee for him in 6 years. The reason was not eccentric wealth. The reason was the autumn evening, 6 years ago, when his private chef of 4 years, a man he had trusted implicitly, slipped a concentrated organophosphate compound into the pasta at Lennox's weekly working dinner. Lennox recognized the numbness in his lips between the second and third bite. He knocked the plate to the floor, called his medic, and spent 4 days in a private hospital suite while his security team quietly located the chef and discovered the competing firm that had bought his loyalty. He recovered completely. His ability to trust food prepared by another person's hands never did. Since that night, Lennox wore thin nitrile gloves when handling anything in the kitchen, ate nothing he hadn't personally unsealed and verified, and maintained a distance from everyone on his staff that had become, over years, absolute. His contact with human skin was clinical, incidental, over before it registered. He had not touched a woman in 6 years. Not because women didn't want to be near him. Lennox was the kind of quietly arresting man who made a room recalibrate the moment he entered it, with a jaw like carved granite and grey-green eyes that catalogued everything in 3 seconds flat, but because his rules were his armor, and he had learned the precise cost of letting armor slip. His niece Piper had been living with him for 10 months. She was 6 years old, small for her age, with her mother's dark curly hair and the watchful eyes of a child who had witnessed something too large for her understanding. Lennox's younger sister Bea had died in a highway accident in January. Piper's father had been gone since before the girl was born. Lennox was the only family she had left. He had hired 4 nannies since Piper arrived. The first quit after 11 days, citing the oppressive atmosphere. The second lasted 3 weeks. The third walked out in tears after Piper, in one of her silent rages, pulled every can from the pantry and stacked them in the hallway at 2 in the morning. The fourth simply stopped answering his calls. Piper had not spoken a single word since January. She ate almost nothing, a few bites of whatever was placed in front of her, pushed to the edges of the plate. She was losing weight in the quiet, alarming way children shouldn't, and the pediatric psychologist Lennox had flown in from Johns Hopkins had recommended, among other things, a more stable domestic environment, specifically someone warm, someone who cooked. His estate manager, a granite-faced Irishman named Callahan, had posted a listing through 3 placement agencies: household culinary manager, live-in, strict dietary protocols in effect, compensation $15,000 monthly. 18 candidates applied. 14 withdrew when Callahan explained the protocols. 3 came, interviewed, and left without the job. The 18th was due to arrive on a Thursday afternoon in mid-September in the rain. Cecily Barrow pulled her 10-year-old Civic into the estate's service entrance because the front gates looked like the kind that required an invitation from God. She was 29 years old, 5'4", and wearing her nicest blazer, which was doing its absolute best across the shoulders of a woman built for comfort rather than couture. She had a sealed tin of cinnamon rolls she'd baked at 4 that morning, sitting in the passenger seat. A sample, she'd told herself, even though the protocol binder said nothing about samples. She'd brought them because she was nervous, and baking calmed her, and she needed something to do with her hands. She needed this job with both of them. Her grandmother Frances, the woman who had raised Cecily after her parents died, who had taught her that feeding people was the most direct form of love available to anyone, was in the early stages of Alzheimer's at a memory care facility in Salem. The monthly cost was $4,300 more than Cecily currently made catering wedding receptions and corporate lunches. The math had been drowning her for 7 months. She had roughly 4 left before it pulled her under entirely. She stepped out of the car into the rain, and immediately her blazer soaked through. "Great," she said to no one. Callahan walked her through the protocols, which took 20 minutes to explain, and made her feel like she was applying to handle enriched uranium, and then brought her into the main house. The kitchen alone made her stop in the doorway. 12-burner range, 2 convection ovens, a walk-in cold storage, a prep island large enough to land a small aircraft, hanging copper pans, an herb garden under grow lights along the south-facing wall, basil, thyme, 2 types of rosemary, all of it tended and alive. "He doesn't use most of it," Callahan said quietly. "Mr. Farrow has his own arrangements." Cecily looked at the grow lights. Someone had planted this kitchen with real intention, and then walked away from it. That struck her as one of the saddest things she'd ever seen. A sound in the doorway, both of them turned. Piper Farrow stood at the threshold in a too large sweatshirt and bare feet, clutching a small stuffed rabbit by its remaining ear. She looked at Cecily with the flat, measuring stare of a child who had been disappointed by a succession of adults and was running the numbers on this new one. Cecily didn't crouch. Her knees had been bad since a fall on a wet restaurant floor 2 years ago, but she shifted her weight and leaned against the island, unhurried. She noticed the girl's eyes drop to the tin. "I brought those for myself," Cecily said conversationally, as though this were simply 2 people in a kitchen. "Stress baking. You know how it is." Piper did not respond, but she didn't leave either. Cecily set the tin on the prep island and peeled back the lid. The smell of cinnamon and brown butter and warm yeast opened up in the kitchen like a door swinging wide. Piper's nose moved just barely. Cecily turned slightly, studying the herb garden. She didn't watch the girl, didn't hover, didn't make it a thing. She just let the smell sit in the room. From the corner of her vision, she saw Piper take 3 small barefooted steps toward the island. Then, 1 more. Then a small hand reached out and took a roll from the tin. Cecily kept looking at the rosemary. Lennox Farrow had been watching from the glass-paneled hallway above the kitchen for the past 4 minutes. He'd been passing when he heard Callahan's voice and had intended to observe the candidate from a professional distance and dismiss her as he'd dismissed the others. He was still standing there because Piper was sitting on the floor against the prep island, eating. Actually eating, pulling the roll apart in spirals the way Bea used to do. Her small shoulders dropped away from her ears for what might have been the first time in 10 months. He felt something shift in his chest. He pressed it back down. When he descended to the kitchen, Cecily looked up from the herb garden and met his eyes without flinching. She did not stand straighter or attempt the performative calm most people layered over their fear of him. She looked tired, somewhat damp, and entirely unimpressed. "Miss Barrow," Lennox said, "you're the 18th candidate." "I know," Cecily said. "It was in the listing. I wanted to see what the fuss was about." He studied her. She studied him back. "The protocols are non-negotiable," he said. "You will never prepare food intended for me. You will not modify my dietary arrangements. You will not touch me." Her eyes moved briefly to his gloved hands, thin black nitrile barely visible unless you were looking, and back to his face. "Understood," she said. No commentary, no visible curiosity, just understood. "Your salary will be as listed," Lennox said. "Your grandmother's facility in Salem will be covered through my private accounts, effective Monday." Cecily went very still. "How do you know about my grandmother?" "Standard security protocol. I know everything about anyone who steps onto my property." He said it flatter than he intended. "It's not personal." She looked at him for a long moment. He expected resentment, or calculation, or the careful gratitude people used when they needed something badly enough. What he got was, "Thank you, I'll take the job." Then she looked down at Piper. "Hey," she said softly, "save me one." Piper looked up. The corner of her mouth moved. Not a smile, the shadow of one, but it was the first expression on that child's face in 10 months that wasn't grief, and it landed in Lennox's chest like something thrown hard. 5 weeks passed, and the estate in Gloucester changed. Not dramatically, not all at once. The way a shift in light changes, gradually, until you stop and realize the quality of the air is entirely different, and you can't remember exactly when it started. Cecily cooked from 8 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, filling the kitchen with smells that moved through the entire house. Rosemary chicken. To tomato soup with grilled cheese for Piper's lunch. On Fridays, something with cinnamon that Piper had begun waiting for at the foot of the kitchen stairs. By 9 a.m. she was eating. Not without careful coaxing on the harder days, but the weight was coming back into her small face. Lennox reviewed the security feeds every evening. He had 12 interior cameras, 4 covering the kitchen, and he had always reviewed them for the purpose of monitoring staff protocols. The purpose had changed, and he knew it, and he did not look at that knowledge directly. He watched Cecily Barrow the way he had watched very few things in his adult life, with his full attention and no particular plan. She moved through the kitchen with a competence that was almost unsettling in its ease, managing 3 things at once, tasting off the back of a spoon with her eyes closed, narrating everything to Piper in an ongoing and unhurried commentary. "That's the acid. See how it brightens the whole thing. Smell it before and after the lemon. Go on, really smell it." And Piper would lean over the pot with her serious face and absorb this like scripture. He watched the soft weight of Cecily's arms when she carried heavy stock pots, watched the way she tucked her chin when Piper did something that made her laugh, watched her sit on the kitchen floor to be at the girl's eye level, her thick legs crossed comfortably, her round face flushed from the heat of the range, like this was the most natural position available to a person. What was becoming an actual problem, separate from the surveillance which he had categorized and set aside, was that she kept making him laugh. Not to his face. She was perfectly professional, warm, but restrained, and she had taken his rules seriously in a way that suggested she had rules of her own worth taking seriously. But she left notes. Brief ones, on the counter, on the refrigerator, once on the door of the kitchen he used alone. Note: "The basil needs more water. I've been neglecting it. This stays between us." The tomato soup from Tuesday is on the 3rd shelf, sealed and labeled. "This is not for you. I just want you to know it exists and can theoretically be smelled from across the room." And once stuck to a box of his protein bars. These contain soy lecithin, which sounds completely made up. He kept all of them in the top drawer of his desk. He didn't examine that fact. The night everything changed was a Tuesday in early November. A pressure system had been building off the coast for 3 days. By 10 p.m. it made landfall like something with a grudge. Wind off the Atlantic hit the estate in gusts that shuddered the old window frames, and the power died at 11:47 with a sound like a breath releasing. Piper was in bed. Lennox was in his home office on the 2nd floor, running through the week's security logs when the cut came. His hand went immediately to the Sig Sauer in the desk drawer, old reflex, older than the poisoning, worn in from a decade of this work. But he sat still in the dark and listened. Wind, the house settling, nothing wrong. Then footsteps in the hall downstairs. He recognized the gate before he heard the voice. "Piper!" Cecily, low and careful, not panicked. "Piper, I'm coming." He tracked her on the phone's secondary feed, moving through the ground floor toward the back stairs. Then a sound he registered a half-second too late. A missed step, a thud, a sharp intake of breath. Lennox was down the stairs in seconds. He found her in the kitchen doorway. She hadn't fallen far. One step she'd misjudged in the dark. But she'd gone sideways into the prep island on the way, and she was sitting on the tile floor with one hand pressed to her hip and the other braced on the cabinet, breathing carefully through her nose in the way that meant she was deciding if something was seriously wrong. The generator kicked on. The kitchen lights came up. She looked up at him. Her expression cycled through embarrassed, then briefly through checking whether he was going to be an ass about it, and landed on wry. "The step," she said. "I've caught it before." "I know," he looked at her. "I saw it on the camera feeds." She stared at him. "To monitor protocol," he said, which was the truth and landed worse than he intended. "Right," Cecily said, "protocol." She tried to push herself up and hissed, her hand going back to her hip. Without thinking, which was the only way it could have happened, because thinking would have stopped it. Lennox crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and reached down. His right hand wrapped around her wrist, then his left, bare. He'd taken both gloves off hours earlier at the security console, came around her arm above the elbow, and he pulled her to her feet. The contact lasted 4 seconds. Cecily Barrow's skin was warm in the way that steady, certain things are warm. Not feverish, not the heat of effort or anxiety, just warm. Her forearm was soft and solid under his palm, and she smelled like the kitchen, like cinnamon and thyme, and something underneath that was simply her. His left hand, the one that had not touched another person in 6 years, registered the sensation with the complete and shocking clarity of a sense that had been held underwater and was now breathing. He waited for the spike, the physiological cascade his nervous system had trained itself to produce at skin contact, the automatic alarm that had kept him safe for 6 years. Instead, her pulse under his thumb, rapid, startled, entirely real. Cecily was standing. She looked at his hands, both of them, bare, and then up at his face. He could see the exact moment she understood that the gloves were usually on, and that they weren't now, and that she was trying to decide what to do with that without making it into something it might not be. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Your hip," he said. "Bruised, it's fine." She tested her weight on it. "Fine." Neither of them moved. "Piper's still asleep," Lennox said, checking the secondary feed on his phone. "Good." Cecily tucked a piece of hair behind her ear. Her eyes moved briefly to his hands, not with pity or fascination, just with the same simple, honest attention she gave the herb garden, and then back to his face. "Go back to bed, Mr. Farrow." He almost told her not to call him that. He turned and went upstairs instead. The threat his security team had been tracking for 2 months arrived 11 days later. Lennox had known for weeks that someone inside the firm was leaking contract details to a competing intelligence group operating out of Atlanta, a group with a particular reputation for taking what they couldn't buy. Watt Halvorsen, his head of security, brought him at 7 in the morning with a face like a man delivering terminal news, was the part he hadn't known. The competing group had run a background check on the Gloucester estate and made a strategic decision. They were going to take Piper. Not to harm her, to hold her, to create the kind of leverage that made men like Lennox sign things without lawyers present. They were coming that night. Lennox spent the day repositioning staff, moving Piper to the estate's safe room under the pretense of a movie night, reconfiguring his external security deployment. He did not tell Cecily. He wanted her calm, and he wanted Piper calm, and he told himself that was the reason, and he only half believed himself. At 11:15, 4 men came over the north perimeter wall. Halvorsen's team took 2 of them at the tree line. The other 2 made it to the house. The first came through the ground floor study window. Lennox was there, and it was over in under a minute. The second used the east kitchen entrance, the service door Cecily propped open on cooking mornings to let the steam out, which she had forgotten to lock tonight. The man was in the kitchen before any interior alarm tripped. Cecily was at the prep island. She had been unable to sleep and had come down for tea, and she was standing there in her robe with the kettle in her hand when the service door opened and a man walked through who was not anyone who worked in this house. She knew it the way the body knows threat before the mind does, a single second of total clarity. The man scanned the kitchen. He was looking for the corridor to the nursery. Cecily set the kettle down. Then she took the 12-inch cast-iron skillet off the pot rack, the lodge she used for Sunday frittata, and she swung it backhanded into the man's shoulder with her full weight behind it the moment he crossed the threshold. The sound was not small. He went into the doorframe. Cecily swung back on the follow-through and caught his ribs, and he went down. She stepped over him, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her back teeth, and ran barefoot down the corridor to the safe room door. She pounded on it with her open palm. "Piper, Piper, it's Cecily, baby. Don't open the door. I just need to hear you. Knock once, if you're okay." One knock from inside. "Good girl," Cecily said, pressing her back to the door, sliding down it until she was sitting on the floor. "You stay right there, good girl." Lennox found her there 30 seconds later. He came around the corner, took in the scene, man on the kitchen floor, skillet in Cecily's hand. Cecily sitting against the safe room door with her knees pulled up and her face pale and completely, fiercely steady, and stood there longer than was strictly necessary. "Halverson," he said into his earpiece. "East kitchen, one down." He kept his eyes on Cecily. "He's alive." "I know he's alive," she said. "I didn't hit him in the head." "I know, shoulder, then ribs." He came back after the shoulder. She set the skillet carefully on the floor. Her hands were shaking, and she looked at them as though they belonged to someone else. "Is Piper safe?" "She's safe." "Okay." She exhaled in one slow, controlled breath. "Okay, good." They moved Piper to the larger interior safe room, the one with the leather couch and the soft lamp Lennox had installed, because he understood that safety meant nothing if it felt like a cell. Piper fell back asleep within 20 minutes, curled against the armrest with her rabbit. Cecily sat on the floor. She always ended up on the floor. Her back was against the couch, one hand resting on Piper's ankle, and she stared at the concrete wall while the adrenaline washed out of her in slow, uneven waves. Lennox came in and sat in the chair across from her. His hands were bare. They had been bare since Halverson arrived and took the scene, since Lennox had stopped needing them to hold a weapon, and he hadn't put the gloves back on. "They came because of me," he said. "I know." "They believed I was vulnerable because of you." He paused. "They weren't wrong." Cecily looked at him. "When I arranged your grandmother's facility payments through my private accounts, a competing intelligence group flagged the transfer." He looked at his hands. "They ran the recipient. Found you. In their assessment, a man in my position who pays a stranger's medical costs without contractual obligation is a man with a weakness. They were correct in their analysis." Cecily was quiet for a moment. "You're saying I put Piper at risk?" "I'm saying I did," Lennox said with a precision that wasn't anger. "By letting you matter, that was my decision." The safe room was very quiet. Piper's breathing was even and slow. "Your gloves," Cecily said. He looked at his hands. "You're not wearing them," she said. "It wasn't a question. You haven't been, not since the kitchen." "No." "When you helped me up, that was the first time. In how long?" 6 years. She didn't fill the space with sound. She was good at that, knowing when language would help and when it would only crowd out something that needed room. "I expected it to feel wrong," Lennox said finally. He turned his palms up, the way she had looked at her own hands 20 minutes earlier on the floor outside the safe room. "When I was poisoned, something in my nervous system decided that skin contact was part of the threat. Hands. Other people's hands. The ritual of eating, of someone preparing food for me, all of it got reclassified as danger. I spent 3 years in behavioral therapy understanding exactly why it was irrational, and 2 more not particularly caring, because the rules worked. The rules kept everything at a distance that felt like safety." He looked at her directly. "And then you grabbed my arm in the dark, and I stood there waiting for the panic response, and instead I felt your pulse." Cecily didn't say anything. She had the quality of a woman who understood some things needed to be said all the way through before a response would do any good. "You're not what I was prepared for," Lennox said. "You sat on my kitchen floor and convinced a child who had stopped eating to eat again, and you did it without fanfare or credit. And you've been in this house for 5 weeks and you leave notes on my protein bars that are funnier than anything anyone on my payroll has said to me in 6 years." He stopped. "I've been watching the kitchen feeds for reasons that stopped being about protocol weeks ago, and I am aware of what that means, and I wanted you to know I'm aware of it." Cecily was still. Then the notes were a gamble. "They were the best one you took." She looked at him for a long moment. Lennox, first name, and he heard himself exhale. "I'm not small, I'm not polished. I'm a line cook from Salem who trips on stairs and brought cinnamon rolls to a professional interview because I panic-baked at 4 in the morning and didn't know what else to do with them." She looked down at her hand on Piper's ankle. "I don't fit in a place like this." Lennox stood up from the chair. He crossed the space between them and sat down on the floor next to her. On the floor, at her level, which was something he had not done with another adult in longer than he could honestly recall. His shoulder was an inch from hers. "You fit here better than anyone has in 6 years," he said, "including me." He looked at Piper sleeping, and then at Cecily's hand, and then he placed his bare palm flat over hers, with the slow deliberateness of a man who understood exactly what he was doing. "I don't want someone who fits a particular shape. I want the woman who picked up a cast-iron skillet and stood between my niece and someone who meant her harm, and then sat down on the floor outside the door because she needed to hear her breathing." He pressed his hand over hers. "I want warmth. I've been standing alone in my kitchen at midnight eating out of foil pouches for 6 years, and the only time I have wanted to sit somewhere and stay is when I'm sitting on the floor next to you." Cecily's eyes were bright. She didn't look away from him. "That might be the strangest thing anyone has ever said to me." "It's accurate," he said. "It is," she agreed softly. On the couch above them, Piper stirred. She rolled toward them, opened her eyes halfway, and looked at the two of them. Side by side on the floor, Lennox's hand over Cecily's, with the grave, careful attention of a child taking in important information. She looked at Cecily, then at Lennox, then at their hands. And in the quietest voice, barely more than breath, the first word she had spoken in 10 months. "Stay." Cecily's hand turned under Lennox's and held on. Later, much later, when the dawn was coming in grey and cold off the Atlantic and the estate was quiet and cleared, Lennox sat at the kitchen table for the first time in 6 years. He sat with his bare hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that Cecily had made, and set in front of him, and that he picked up and drank without once reaching for the drawer where the gloves were kept. Piper came downstairs and climbed into the chair beside him without being asked, her rabbit tucked under her arm. Cecily put a cinnamon roll on the table between them. The three of them sat there in the winter morning light, the Atlantic going pale silver out the windows, and not a word needed to be said, because the most fortified things Lennox had ever built were not the estate's walls or the security protocols, or the 6 years of careful, sterile distance he'd kept between himself and everything that could hurt him. They were inside him, and they hadn't been broken by force or fear, or the men who came over the north perimeter wall in the dark. They'd been undone, quietly and completely, by a woman who baked at 4 in the morning, left notes on his protein bars, sat on kitchen floors like it was the most natural place in the world, until sitting beside her felt like the only place that made any sense at all. If this story stayed with you, if you believe that real strength comes in every shape, and that the walls we build to stay safe are sometimes exactly what we need someone else to walk right through, hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to Sharp Curves for more stories about the women the world underestimates, and the moments that change absolutely everything.